I begin this afternoon by explaining how he wanted to make a Dominican out of Aristotle. You will know that the medieval debates between Dominicans on the one hand and Franciscans on the other, they often centered on whether it is the intellect or the will that is the primary human faculty, the greatest mark of being a human being. And the Franciscans typically said it was the will, not the intellect. Whereas for Aquinas, both in the present life and in the life after death, it is the intellect that is the dominant human faculty. It's a bit too simple to say that St. Thomas was an intellectualist and the Franciscans were voluntarists, but it is a simplification which catches a lot of truth. I will explain the Franciscan side a little later when we come to the great Oxford Franciscan John Duns Scotus. At the moment, I want to concentrate on the way in which Aquinas carries forward the intellectualist tradition of Aristotle, thinking of the intellect as the highest human faculty and the intellectual virtues of the highest human virtues. It must be said that this emphasis is something which comes rather more into St. Thomas from Aristotle than from the Bible. And this point was always emphasized by the Franciscans, that it is really love, not knowledge, even the highest intellectual knowledge, that is the most important thing. As a Dominican, St. Thomas belonged to an order which was still a novelty in the Catholic Church of the time. The two mendicant orders, the Begging Friars, both Franciscan and Dominican, were a novelty. They were not like Benedictine monks, resident in grand landed estates surrounding an abbey. They were much more like urban missionaries. They went from place to place, preaching their particular types of reform and carrying out debates with the particular heresies that they had in mind. The mendicant orders of Franciscans and Dominicans were the object of considerable suspicion by conservative Catholics at the time, because St. Thomas has for so long been regarded as a kind of official spokesman for Catholic theology. It's important to recall to mind that he was on the very fringe of Catholic theology at the time, under suspicion, both because of his belonging to a mendicant order which was thought to threaten the traditional academic supremacy of the Benedictines, and also, of course, because of his embrace that he gave to the ancient Greek philosophy of Aristotle, a very warm embrace, as I have said earlier. Now, members of the older religious orders, they argued that begging, which was what both Dominicans and Franciscans did, was something disgraceful for those who could work with their own hands. My closest Dominican friend, a lifelong friend, Father Herbert McCabe, OP, in Blackfriars in Oxford, he used always to travel by hitchhiking. He said that was the 20th century equivalent of the Dominican vocation to be a beggar, that hitching a lift was somehow more decent in the 20th century than holding out a hand for money. But after a while, his superiors did not much like the idea of him hitchhiking, and of course it was a time it became very dangerous. On the other hand, the secular clergy, where the parish clergy resented the mendicant orders because they thought they would hear the confessions of the faithful who should really be going to their parish priests. And the role of the mendicants seemed to blur the familiar boundaries between active and contemplative religious orders, and this is where Aristotle comes in again. And several times in his life, Aquinas got involved in controversies with those who were attacking the mendicant orders. And when he's describing and justifying the ideal of the Dominican order of preachers, once again he makes frequent use of texts of Aristotle from the first and last books of the Ethics. And in particular, in his treatment of the active and contemplative life towards the end of the Secunda Secundae, he addresses questions which still to this day preoccupy the exegesis of Aristotle among modern commentators. I'm thinking now of in the Secunda, the Prima Secundae, question 179. Aristotle speaks of a perfect life, and there is a question: what does he mean by a life? Is it a way of life or a biography or what? Is the happy life, is it just the chosen supreme activity of the happy person, or does it include all the other vital activities as well? Well, St. Thomas, when in this article he discusses the active and contemplative life, he notes the possible ambiguity. But he says that in this context, life means what a person most enjoys and is most devoted to. And the active life is one devoted to external actions. The contemplative life is one devoted to the contemplation of truth. Now, it's a question discussed to this day by commentators on Aristotle. Is Aristotle's happy man, the pure contemplative, does he possess the moral virtues or does he not? And the answer seems to be that the contemplative happy person does indeed possess the moral virtues, but the exercise of the moral virtues is not part of his happiness. And that is the answer which is given by Aquinas. The moral virtues are necessary for the contemplative. There's no doubt about that. Well, why are they necessary? In order to prevent his contemplation of truth from being disrupted by passion or by tumult. But the moral virtues are not an essential part of the contemplative life itself. He says that also in following question 180. Now, when he comes to compare the worth of the active life with the worth of the contemplative life, once again he draws heavily on Aristotle to prove that the contemplative life is superior to the active life. He offers 9 arguments, and 8 of his 9 arguments are taken verbatim from the last chapter of the Nicomachean Ethics. I summarize them. The contemplative life is the activity of the best thing in us. Second, it is the most continuous activity. Third, it is the pleasantest activity. Fourth, it is the most self-sufficient. It's sought for its own sake. Sixth, it is leisurely. Seventh, it is godlike. And eighth, it is most truly human. And in the Summa, he has each of the texts from Aristotle paired with either a biblical or patristic text. Aristotle standing side by side with the Bible, standing side by side with the Fathers. For instance, he will take Rachel and Leah, or Mary and Martha, as representatives of the 2 lives. Mary, the contemplative life, and Martha, the active life, busy in the kitchen while Mary is talking to the Messiah. And as we saw earlier in the treatment of the Beatitudes, surprisingly, Aquinas pays more attention to the literal meaning of the Aristotelian texts than he does to the biblical ones. Now, whereas Aquinas sides wholeheartedly with Aristotle in valuing the contemplative life above the active life, he shifts perspective in an interesting way when he comes to treat of the vocations of the religious orders. He says that all religious orders are instituted for the sake of charity, and charity includes both love of God and love of neighbor. But the distinction between the 2 orders is to be stated in the following way. The contemplative orders seek to spend time on God alone. The active orders seek to serve the needs of their fellows. This is now, we've moved to Secunda. 188. He says the contemplative orders want to spend time on God alone, soli Deo vacare. Vacare is the word, of course, used for a vacation, vacant scole. And this was translated by Herbert McCabe, my Dominican friend, as wasting time on God alone. Vacare being the word for sort of leisure. Well, Aquinas then asks, which are to be preferred, contemplative or active orders? Instead of giving an immediate answer, he says, well, there are 2 kinds of active life. There's one kind of active life which consists entirely in external actions. He says the giving of alms to the poor, or looking after wayfarers. I suppose he has in mind people like the St. Bernard monks with their dogs, looking after people who get lost in the Alps. But he says there's another kind of active life, and it is an active life, which consists in teaching and preaching. Now, in these activities, the religious person is drawing on the fruits of contemplation. The religious person has and continues to contemplate. But he doesn't just contemplate for himself alone, but he passes on to others the truths that he grasps. And he says that while the purely contemplative life is to be preferred to the purely active life, the best life of all for a religious is the life which includes teaching and preaching as well as contemplating. I quote, "Just as it is better to light up others than to shine alone, so it is better to share the fruits of one's contemplation with others than to contemplate in solitude." That's in there. "Sicut enim maius est illuminare quam lucere solum, ita maius est contemplata aliis tradere quam solum contemplare. Sic ergo summum gradum in religionibus tenent quae ordinando ad docendum et predicandum." So that is a kind of manifesto in favour of the order of preachers. St. Thomas is too polite to specify what religious order he has in mind in this. But his phrase, contemplata aliis tradere, to hand on to others those things that you have contemplated, that phrase of his was able to serve as a motto for the Dominican order. Now, in this final glorification of the ideals of his own order as superior to any other kind of life, Aquinas very properly doesn't make any appeal to Aristotle. But even here, there is an instructive comparison to be drawn between the teachings of the two philosophers. As I said this morning, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle presents two ideals of happiness. The first superior idea is a first-class happiness, which consists in pure contemplation. And there's a second-class happiness, which consists of exercising human wisdom and moral virtues. But in the Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle presents a single idea of happiness, which includes both a contemplative and an active element. And indeed, in the Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle describes the happiest life as the contemplation and service of God, the exercise of the moral virtues being considered in that point by Aristotle, as by Aquinas, as a form of service of God. Now, what Aquinas does is to transpose the Nicomachean first-class happiness into a spiritualized afterlife where alone it is really at home. Whereas in the present life, Aquinas' own ideal is much closer to that of the Eudemian Ethics, combining contemplation and action while seeking to practice the service of God in the particular form of teaching and preaching. Before I leave Aquinas, there's one more issue that I want to touch on, which is on your handout as number 10. It's what is the relation between Aquinas' account of happiness as the ultimate aim of every action. How does that relate to the freedom of the will, the possibility of choice between different things? How can the necessary desire for happiness be reconciled with that freedom of the will which is an essential attribute of human beings. He believes that I cannot help but desire happiness. He believes that happiness is only to be found in God. Well, if that is so, how is it possible for a human being to turn away from God and commit sin? And his answer goes like this. There are some particular goods that have no connection with happiness because a human being can be happy without them. Nothing necessitates the will to want these unnecessary goods. But there are other things which do have a necessary connection with happiness, the things that unite men to God, in whom alone is true happiness to be found. But until the necessity of the link is brought home to us by a vision of God, the will is not necessitated either to want God or the things of God. That's the end of the quote. Now, I think it's not altogether satisfactory to reconcile in this way the belief in freedom with the postulate that humans necessarily need happiness. On the one hand, the mere fact that a particular good is not necessarily connected with my happiness isn't sufficient to establish that I'm free not to use it. If I'm a chain smoker who gets through 100 cigarettes a day, am I free at any moment to stop smoking? Well, perhaps I am, perhaps not. But the mere fact that smoking is not an essential ingredient of happiness isn't enough to establish that I'm free. On the other hand, I think there's something wrong with the fundamental premise that Aquinas shares with both Aristotle and Augustine, namely their fundamental premise that one cannot help but pursue whatever one regards as necessary for one's happiness. I think that just psychologically that is not correct. A wife may be convinced that she will never be happy unless she leaves her difficult husband, and yet she may decide to stay with him for the sake of the children. She's not pursuing her own happiness, putting other people's happiness above her own. That is surely, certainly, psychologically possible, and it may well indeed be morally preferable. I think the fundamental weakness of the eudaimonism, the happiness theory that we have been considering so far, is that they place morality on a basis that is ultimately self-centered. And this is true both of the pagan eudaimonism of Aristotle and of the Christian eudaimonism of Augustine and Aquinas. And I think that compared with that feature, it's less important whether the ultimate self-satisfaction that is held out as the foundation of morality is a happiness that's to be realized in this world or in the next. Of course, Aristotle agreed that the happy person would need friends, and he has, in fact, a lot of very useful and insightful things to say about happiness. He says that even his ideal philosopher could probably philosophize better in company than on his own. And again, of course, Augustine and Aquinas taught that we must love our neighbor, as we are commanded to do by the God whose vision is our ultimate goal. But in each case, in Aristotle, in Augustine, and in Aquinas, the concern for the welfare of others is presented as a means to an ultimate goal of self-fulfillment. Now, it took a long time for, I think, Christians to realize how odd this was. The first philosopher in the Christian tradition to do so, so far as I know, was St. Anselm, the 12th century Archbishop of Canterbury. He was followed later with much greater detail and much greater argument by the 14th century Oxford Franciscan John Duns Scotus. Now, while Augustine and Aquinas had followed Aristotle in placing happiness at the apex of their ethical systems, Augustine and Aquinas did differ from Aristotle because they accepted that human beings must obey a natural law, a law which was written in the hearts of man by the Creator God. And in tomorrow's lectures, I want to follow out the contrast between law-based systems of ethics and the happiness-based systems that we've been considering so far. Of course, Aquinas did believe that things like murder, abortion, and usury were all violations of the natural law of God. But Aquinas structured his ethical system not around the concept of law, but around the idea that virtue was the route to self-fulfillment in happiness. It was Duns Scotus who gave the theory of divine law the central place that it was to occupy in the thought of Christian moralists from then on. And I regard Scotus as being the progenitor of the obsession with law, which I think is characteristic in different ways of both Reformation and counter-Reformation moral theory. Scotus did agree with Aristotle and Aquinas that human beings have a natural tendency to pursue happiness. But he didn't agree with them that everything we do is an expression of this natural tendency. He wanted to say that we have another natural tendency as well, the tendency to pursue justice. And this natural appetite for justice is a tendency to obey the moral law, no matter what the consequences may be for our own well-being. And for Scotus, human freedom is much broader than it was for Aquinas. According to Aquinas, human freedom was the freedom to choose between possible means towards happiness, whereas human freedom for Scotus consists in the power to weigh in the balance the conflicting demands of morality and happiness. And this seems to me a much more plausible, though not wholly satisfactory, account of what human freedom consists in. Later, of course, to be denied by Luther, but the human freedom that Luther was denying was freedom as understood by Scotus, not freedom as understood by Aquinas. So, Scotus, in this attack on Aquinas, very, very soon, of course, after Aquinas, there's only one generation, 25 years or so, which separates Aquinas' death and Scotus's lectures in Oxford. But I think they're 25 of the most significant years in the history of philosophy, because I think that Scotus turned in many different fields. Scotus turned philosophy in a new direction, by throwing over already many of the Aristotelian ideas. It took Luther to totally denounce Aristotle and say that he was that Aristotelian reason was just a prostitute. But I think that the ancestry of Lutheran anti-Aristotelianism is already there in Scotus, even though Scotus, like all medieval scholastics, pays a great deal of deference to Aristotle. I think that on this issue, Scotus was right and Aquinas was wrong. I think he was quite right to say that happiness was not the only possible aim in life. Unless a philosopher makes it true by definition, it's surely wrong to maintain that one's happiness is the only possible aim in life. A person may map out his life or her life in the service of someone else's happiness, or may map out his life in furtherance of some political cause which may be unlikely to triumph during his lifetime. Of course, suicide bombers are a prime example of that. I think it's quite wrong to think that every Islamic suicide bomber does it simply in order to meet these beautiful women in heaven. I think the motive is much more to secure the triumph of Islam, the revenge against those who have injured it, and also, I think, coherence and collaboration with one's fellows. I think that is the really strong motive. And it is, bad though it is an altruistic motive in which is something quite different from the kind of Aristotelian motive which sees everything as ultimately for one's own sake, for one's own greater good. Now, that's where I'm going to stop today. You will see that we are at number 11. Now, tomorrow I will be, St. Thomas will still be always at the back of my mind. I will be much less focused on St. Thomas. I want to take the history of the philosophy of happiness from Duns Scotus to the present day, and the different kinds of reaction to the Aristotelian Thomist idea of happiness that have been that have been pursued and expounded by philosophers from that day to this. I won't pause for questions because I found today that such a pause did not generate a large number of questions, but I would hope that overnight you might think of questions that have been left in your mind by what I've had to say today, and you might write them down, and we might begin tomorrow with a question and answer section where you can say where you're unhappy about what I've said today, where you think I've got the history wrong. Of course, I have not expressed my own opinions about happiness today, except by way of criticizing the self-centered type of happiness that Aristotle and Aquinas maintain. Tomorrow, I will try to put forward some more positive ideas about what happiness consists in and what its relation is to the moral systems of the great philosophers.